Welcome, everybody, to a very special episode of the Doomer Optimism podcast. I am here with the first-time host, Sam Sager, and the famous, infamous David Holmgren. Since Sam is new, I'm going to have him briefly introduce himself. You all know me, and then we'll get into the conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Ashley. Sam Sager, it's so good to be here. It's a real honor. I've been listening to this podcast for a while and following David's work, so I'm super excited to chat with you all. I tend to a quarter acre suburban property, and so I'm really looking forward to digging into David's ideas.
Awesome. And then David, for those of you who don't know you, do you want to give us a one or two sentence intro to yourself?
Yeah, well, I was the young co-author of Permaculture One in 1978 that kicked off the permaculture concept to the world at a time when there was a huge interest in all of things we would associate with sustainability, including sort of grassroots backyard responses. And that's, of course, shaped my life. So I was the co-originator of the concept with Bill Mollison, and I'm lesser known in that role than Bill was. He was a decade older than me, and he travelled around the world a lot, whereas I've been a bit more of a home person, but also I think internationally recognised increasingly in terms of the theoretical background to permaculture through my major work, Permaculture Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, that was published in 2002. But in terms of, practical positive responses, my Retrosuburbia work that Sam was referencing is inspired a lot of people and has been a big part of my focus over the last decade or so.
Wait, Sam, I want to let you go first and ask the first question, but I just want to frame this discussion for those listening a little bit. We have in our little circles been talking a little bit about, if we're going to have like a permacultural future, what is it going to look like? Who's going to be growing food? Obviously, more people are going to be involved in growing food. What do cities look like? What do rural areas look like? And we had a frequent guest on the show is Chris Smage, who wrote the book A Small Farm Future. And he's got this idea that we'll repopulate more rural areas in general, but he's open to, producing food all over the place wherever we can. And we've had Chuck Marone on, who's like a strong towns, new urbanism advocate. And so I'm really excited for this discussion because I think the suburbs are extremely overlooked. And so, yeah, we'll dig into that. And Sam, you can go first.
Yeah, well, that's a perfect lead in. I think when I started gardening and just jumping into this world, there's so many resources for big homesteads. And, I was sitting on a quarter acre and not really sure what to do with it. And so I stumbled upon your book. And so I'd love to hear you describe like why the suburbs, what's so powerful, and what role do you think they can play in all of this?
Well, I suppose the first thing is we are already in the crisis. So the majority of the population are going to be adapting in situ. If we look at how long it takes to rebuild city residential and infrastructure with a rapidly growing economy with cheap energy, it takes about 100 years at a minimum. So when you put that in, context, most people are going to sort of be dealing with whatever they're dealing with. And I think there's also a strong recognition in the lineage of permaculture that nowhere is actually a blank slate, even though a lot of permaculture people would associate it with people moving to a blank piece of rural land and starting from scratch with some sort of residential use. So I think that's the first thing. And in countries like Australia and the United States especially, low density residential building is the default template that, where most people live. And it is potentially a sweet point between the rural environments where you have access to more land, access to more resources in the sense of the resources of nature, and more autonomy and freedom of action And at the other side, cities which provide that density and interconnection between people and exchange. And potentially the suburbs is actually a sweet point between those two, because you've actually got enough density for the redevelopment of local economy and community, even if it's not there between those people who are within walking, bicycling distance. Currently that potential is there. Whereas rural areas are always beset by the tyranny of distance. And that we tend to ignore that, because of cheap energy. And cities are very hard to structurally change. There's a lot more lock-in. So it requires the whole of society or a lot more stakeholders to agree to really do remake of cities, so that the actions that can happen in cities are more conservative within the current paradigm. There's more radical freedom in rural areas, especially remote rural areas, to do wild experimental things. And in a way, the suburbs potentially is that sweet point. And we know in terms of growing fresh, perishable food, which is a lot of people are sort of focused on that very important issue, and it's been a big part of permaculture, that the classic quarter-acre block is capable of producing that fresh food for a household with, without a great deal of difficulty in most climates.
I'd add it's a really good starting point too, because even with a quarter acre, I was overwhelmed at first. So I can't imagine what people do with 5 to 10 acres.
It is amazing what you can produce in such a small space. We can get into that, I think, in some of the specific details, because I think there's I don't know, I kind of want to jump to this separate question we didn't have in the order before, but I think a lot of people that I interact with who worry about sustainability, I'm in a lot of environmentalist academics and policy circles, are just critical of this incremental bottom-up approach, because they think it's not enough. And I'm extreme advocate for this bottom-up approach. I feel very worried about top-down solutions. A lot of them are not adequate themselves. They're politically difficult. So I wonder your thoughts on this, bottom-up versus top-down. Do you still get, do you get people pushing back? Do you get, people, techno-utopians thinking, we should just solve it with the UN or something?
Yeah, well, there's those two levels acting, which tend to go together. Top-down solutions and hyper-technical complexity of solutions. And it's logical because it's only those scales that can deal with, very high levels of complexity. And I think, firstly, there's that problem that we are in the crisis. So the top-down solutions, when they come, are actually late and hard. And that's the essence of, one of the messages in my future scenarios work, where I suggested late crisis response in my brown tech scenario, which I believe we are now living in, is very sort of, you could say ham-fisted, but it's just when things are done late and hard from the top, there's the preparedness to break this, do this for long-term objectives that may or may not work, huge risks involved. And there's a tendency to lock into a one-size-fits-all, whereas the bottom-up approaches are inherently more diverse because they're subject to many more localized influences, where people try something, even if they're in the modern world, ideologically and network connected, so ideas can spread globally and ideas can be applied in a fashion way. And, had quite a lot of that in permaculture over the decades. It then gets tested at, does this actually work here? Whereas the large-scale solutions from the top, they are immune to the fact that the thing is actually failing at the bottom. because there's the message doesn't get back, and there's this continued power to push. And this was very well documented in historical work by John Ralston Saul, the Canadian historian, Voltaire's Bastards, Dictatorship of Reason in the West, of this, that instead of responding to reality, that systems at the top try and create reality. And then they just keep doing the same thing, even if it's not working, because there's not the negative feedback. Oh, that didn't work. The bottom-up solutions are very subject to negative feedback. That's diving into a sort of a deep sort of systemic sort of view of why these things are the case. I view a lot of the descriptions of we need urgent big action as very politically naive, whereas people often project onto permaculture that permaculture's politically naive because it doesn't sort of articulate itself as a political strategy. And that's actually one of its strengths, that it doesn't require that you actually even believe in climate change or, anything in particular to see the common sense in some of its solutions. And that's why some activists have described it as revolution disguised as gardening.
I love that. And you're totally speaking my language. My dissertation research, I spoke to some people who had these giant gardens and fishing, hunting. Their whole house is filled with canned, preserved food. And then I'm talking to them about what they're doing. Everything's organic, conservation minded. And then they say, but climate change isn't real. And it's like, yeah. Okay, I don't care. I mean, I honestly really just don't care if you think it's real or not. I mean, you're doing the work that it has a small scale, tiny footprint production,
And
sorry,
that there are those skills.
Oh, go ahead, David.
And there are those skills that need to be transferred to the people who do believe in climate change, not just for their own resilience to what is happening, but also as a continuing real contribution to actually mitigating those things, if not in absolute terms, but at the ethical level of, oh, well, this is actually a way of life which is radically reducing those contributions. So it doesn't matter which way you sort of cut it. There's ways of finding that commonality. And I think it's also unrealistic to expect in a time of cultural chaos and breakdown to get this sort of one unified view about what the hell is going on in the world. Like as there was at the last days of Rome, there were 1,000 voices, 1,000 groups, all with different views. We haven't been paying enough attention to the old gods. It's the corruption of government. It's, we need to sort of take notice of these new weird people called Christians. I mean, there were many, many different groups, and everyone knew that the system was broken, but there were many, many different sort of answers or responses to that.
Yeah,
Sam, you could take the next one.
That's great. I think as you start going down the permaculture rabbit hole, I know this happened to me, it's easy to start kind of getting these grand visions and want to build things from scratch and, get a big plot of land to get your friends. And, so I'd love to hear you talk about why retrofit. I think it's such a powerful concept.
Yeah, well, it relates to sort of the core black box of permaculture, which is design process. Because a lot of the start from scratch and the big vision sort of hopes to assemble a complex working ecological system by assembling all the components based on prior knowledge and everything. And apart from being overwhelming, it almost never works when done like that from scratch with novel elements and systems that have not actually been tried in that landscape or that socioeconomic context before. So that's one of the problems with that. Whereas retrofit is a sort of an incremental process where it's undeniable that there is already a context. There isn't a blank slate. you're starting with something, and it's not ideal. And that requires that you actually sort of analyze the context in great detail to look for where are the opportunities within the structural problems of, oh, well, the house doesn't face the right way for passive solar design, or the way the street is constructed, or a million different things that we're constrained by, and to find what are those opportunities to just make a small intervention which achieves a direct benefit immediately, but in a sense of the art of this sort of living process design, where as you keep doing things, each thing keeps adding and improving the situation, and that you manage to avoid the problem of what I call a design cul-de-sac, where you go, oh, I've done all these things, and oh, now we need to actually knock all that down and start again with that part, which can happen. But, the art of trying to layer, like our ancestors did in a way, ancient towns and buildings were just little bits kept being added organically. So I think that's much more empowering for a lot of people in terms of capital, technical skill, risks of bad mistakes are a lot less. And I think that applies at the built scale of whether we're, modifying buildings, installing water tanks or whatever, the built side of permaculture. And it applies in the biological, dealing with soil and plants, and most places have got some sort of existing vegetation, even if it's just a lawn. And there's no doubt that a lot of the best permaculture retrofit places have got these sort of blank, relatively sterile lawns, and oh good, no big trees, so we can put the trees where they need to be, rather than, oh, what, there's an enormous bloody great pine tree on the sun side, and we're in a cool temperate climate. Oh well, like maybe we should be at another house, or maybe we need to bring in the logging contractor first. That being able to assess all those things, both in the sense of an existing place where we're committed, or when we're looking for where to go. And Retrosuburbia addresses both that of how do we adapt to what we've got, and also where are the opportunities that other people don't see.
I want to jump into these 3Bs eventually, but you just struck on a different point that I want to address before we move on. Okay, so I host these homesteading 101 classes where I organize all these people I know who are like really into homesteading. I get people who come and talk about small livestock, people come and talk about cows, people talk about, orchards, all different kinds of things. And I've noticed the people who are attracted to doomer optimism and the people who are attracted to my class are like early adopter types, if you know what I mean, in the adoption diffusion literature.
Yeah.
And they are like, they're extremely conscientious, and they have analysis paralysis. They do not know, they ask me questions like, well, how do I make sure I maximize the homestead, and how do I make sure I'm like doing it all right at first, and my answer and the answer of the instructors is something along the lines of like, learn as much as you can, but then you just get started with something and learn by iterating. So I just wonder if you must have encountered this a lot in your career, this analysis paralysis attitude, and what do you tell people about that?
Yeah, well, I certainly, went through a lot of that when I was young myself. Being a big thinker, in some ways, the more educated you are and the more of a big thinker you are, the more this is a problem. And especially in combination, but just being overeducated, and there's so much information available to us today, so there's definitely that issue of starting small, trying something, And I think that is definitely for a lot of people who are in the suburbs or have a connection sometimes to a family home where they could choose to do something, especially for younger people, of getting started in one's head and trying something, because that will inform whatever you do next. And I think it's really important also, often there's the question of, oh, but what about people who don't own? There is no point in doing things when you don't own. And this was a question that was put to me where, when I was in my 20s, people often said to me, so why are you doing all this work on other people's property that you don't own? And I say, look, I get to use other people's land, tools, I learn things from them. And sure, I've got a lot of energy to contribute, but what I take away in my head is worth way more than whatever I have left behind that I no longer, have. And I think that's sort of really important opportunity, especially for young people who are feeling disenfranchised, that they can't do something, because it is that stepping stone and it is that learning. And often, it's great to prototype things, try things, and then it's always better the next time. So I think that's an important part of that question.
Sam, you want to take the 3 Bs or get us started?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when a lot of people think of permaculture, I think I did at least, they think a lot about the biological field and just growing plants and all of that. And so in your book, the construct you introduced, I thought was super useful. So we thought it'd be fun if you could share that with everybody.
Yeah.
I think starting with the built field, we'd love to hear a bit about that framework and how you think those three are all connected.
Yeah, well, definitely, although permaculture has become associated with the biological side, and that is like really important, and I don't think that has gone away, because actually, at least in the Western world, we actually have enough buildings already. If you look at it en masse, like and when you sort of, a lot of the discretionary economy goes away, there'll be so many buildings that can be retrofitted for residential use. So we don't actually need to build anything new. For starters, retrofitting is the only building industry that's actually needed. But food has to be produced every year. You come to next season, you've got to do it again. So there's, very good reasons why permaculture is very focused on food and, the impacts of what agriculture has been on the world is, historically the big one. But I think different people come to things with different skill sets and different passions. And modern people are incredibly housebound, incredibly indoor people, and their state of well-being is hugely dependent on their built environment or the sense of it. Even in climates that are really mild and really people could wash outside under a tap, they got used to it without hot water. And of course, there are other climates where it is like really critical. And if you don't have heating in the winter, you actually freeze to death. So there's that range of how important the built environment is. But we can see that it's not just the climatic things and not just space, but it is also how people perceive and experience that. So I suppose also that I would consider myself a better ecological builder than ecological farmer. I'm a very passionate woodworker. I've built 3 passive solar houses in my day, 2 of them for my mother, actually. One in the 1970s and one on our property for her to live in her last years. But so I think that modification of the building, and it's something that, a lot of people thinking about being off-grid or prepping, they often think that, energy, water, all of those things. Okay, what's the mechanics of that? How does that work? And the other aspect, of course, is if we actually live a more home-based lifestyle, then actually our houses become really critical multifunctional workspaces, which is they always were historically, but in the modern era they've been sort of dormitory sort of places to sleep and do a few recreational activities. Whereas re-inhabiting the home does mean, how does this building actually work? Is the kitchen large enough? Do we have enough actually bulk foods storage? All sorts of things about the way you live actually then also requires rearranging or doing things differently with the built environment. So that does involve all those classic architectural design rethinking sort of stuff. And it's also a way to redirect that energy of the habitual renovator, that people, want to repaint the house, want to do something. So how can those energies or dispositions or things people feel comfortable in doing that they already know about be directed in ways that actually set up households for home-based, productive, suburban homesteading?
Sam, I want to let you talk a little bit about your setup if you want right now.
Sure. Yeah, your book actually inspired this. So I run a fitness business, helping people with exercise. And the standard is, you get a location that's away from your home, close to people's work. So I was looking at doing that and reading your book at the same time. And it got me thinking, I was like, wait, I have this huge garage that I'm, underutilizing. And so I converted it into a gym that I now work with people in. And it's a constraint, right? It's limited in some ways, but there's so many benefits because I'm here. I get to tend to the land more. When people come over for it, I can hand them some vegetables on their way out. And people, it's now really part of the experience. And so that was just an example of, I think, the way that I would have never thought about that. I think I would have just followed the standard route.
Well, even before going any further, Sam, I want you to write that up as a case study for the Retrosuburbia website.
Absolutely.
Because, that's exactly was part of my vision when I started going beyond looking at the template of sort of suburbs that I grew up in, of houses built in the 50s and 60s, to looking at the template of houses built since the 90s, of larger houses filling small blocks, and all sorts of other things that made them difficult to retrofit, and often, big double garage, sometimes triple garage at the front. And started to think about that. Oh, wow, these are sort of like places of work where people can run activities or shops, informal shops behind the shutter doors and out on the forecourt with their wares, or all sorts of different possibilities that weren't there in some of the older suburban houses. So that idea of a home gym is exactly as you say.
I love that so much too, and I'm very curious about the social aspect of these things. So I love that Sam's story, because there is something really wholesome about and traditional about having the business in the home. Then you have more people passing through your home, and it's not like this thing that we have now where we make an appointment to see one another, but you're just kind of passing through. People will just come over, and then you're not separated from your family, and the family life and work life is kind of mixed together. I think post-pandemic, a lot of people are kind of confused about the work-life balance thing. And I wonder if we might make a case for this, because, I think most people, they slept at their home, their kids went somewhere else, they went to an office, and then everybody came home during the pandemic, and everyone's now reevaluating this. Like, do I work? And I do think there is something really revolutionary for those of us who can do remote work, to work remotely, and, the knock-on effects of that. I'd be interested to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, well, it's certainly, having a work from home base, for 35 years. Of course, for us, it's sort of been completely natural with a home office and then with tours coming to our Meliadora property, and that intersection, as Sam was saying, between working at the desk and those seedlings need moving under cover at night because I'm daydreaming looking out the office window. that interaction between those different worlds and the efficiency of office lunches here at Meliadora, cooking for people who are working in the office along with us. So there's those economies of scale. I think for a lot of people, of course, that's a huge challenge because they've been used to a very compartmentalized life. And so a segregated life. And this principle in permaculture of integrate rather than segregate, of course, applies in the farm, of integrating plant and animal systems and different species. And of course, when you just throw things together, conflicts also arise. There's got to be sort of harmonious interactions, and in some cases, some degree of partitioning, separation, or time scheduling, or limits, so one thing doesn't take over the other. And we do have this habitual experience, I believe, in modern affluent societies where money as a measure of everything we do, takes over everything else. And so we get very thingy about our little bits of non-monetary economy, of whether it's family and different exchanges, and we sort of hold them in a little ghetto that we are defending from the way money contaminates everything. Whereas the way we've lived for 30, 40 years, it's actually rebuilding that household and community non-monetary economy, taking over things from the monetary economy. So when you have that confidence that these precious personal gift things that all humans hold as precious still are capable of actually growing, then the ambiguous complexity and grey areas between those, like sharing property with people, and some aspects of that are monetary and some are not, are possible to navigate. But it is tricky stuff. And, whether we're sharing with our parents or whether we're sharing, like Sam is talking about, sharing with your business customers, your private place, all of those things involve the consideration of boundaries, the consideration of balance. And one of the tools in Retrosuburbia that was the work-life balance, because often people think of that as a one-dimensional thing. There's the money making, what we do for a living, and then there's the rest of life. Whereas we use that matrix to say there's monetary dominated activity, both work and play, which is sort of like consumption mostly, buying things. And then there's the non-monetary, which we call permaculture productivity. This is a work, growing food, fixing the car, whatever. And then there's play, where we just sort of don't really buy anything. We just engage like children naturally are in enjoying the sunshine or sort of reading a book and saying, okay, that's 4 quadrants. Where is your life at the moment? Where are your hours spent? And then maybe how's that balanced or complemented by partners or other household members? And then, okay, what changes would you like to make in that balance? So we're trying to give more tools for people to navigate these complexities that the conventional society and discussions, don't provide any guidance for how to deal with these things.
Sam, you want to go next?
Yeah, I love that visual, by the way. I think that actually may have been what got me on this podcast, because I shared it and I think Ashley saw it. When you were talking about, those different components, one of your concepts that came to mind, which is recreating the commons. So I live in a community, there's about 80 houses, kind of it backs up against a forest. There's a kind of pond that is pretty, contaminated, just nobody uses it for anything. There's also some big open space that's somewhat public. I'd love to hear if you have any examples or stories about how communities like that kind of took a more collaborative approach and started to kind of recreate those commons.
Yeah, well, this is one of the opportunities of suburbia, that there are large areas of public space, and where those are not manicured and controlled, and there's huge amount of invested both bureaucratic and stakeholder engagement with keeping it exactly like it is, there's enormous opportunities in the sort of, if not abandoned, then neglected spaces that people don't use, to start informally, quietly using those in ways where you are treading lightly with the social license, but sometimes not bothering about the legal license. And whether that's, walking the goats to graze out on the common, or the poultry is going through a pop hole in the fence to sort of run out on the common. My partner Sue, she grew up in a country town in rural New South Wales, and her mother's poultry used to go out onto the common space in that way. Of course, where we live in small village in Hepburn Springs, this town was very much a commons managed by the people until the 1960s, when people got rid of their house cows and all got oil heaters, so stopped cutting wood, and all the common was effectively abandoned. When we came in the 80s, there was this huge wild wilderness, downstream from us, and we've partnered with people who are part of that older, fourth generation local families to bring the sort of the ecological newcomer and the old rural, dare I say, redneck culture together, and create spaces where there's been no public funding, no public approval, and a sort of anarchistic, sort of permaculture inspired form of what's formerly called land care in Australia, but without the paperwork and the poisons. So we are doing ecological restoration work, but it's, always with that bent of making the environment in our region more safe against wildfire, more amenable and accessible, and also future and current food production, as well as all the ecological functions that are needed in those spaces. And we have a sort of highfalutin name for the place. We call it the Spring Creek Community Forest. But it's just people going down the gully, on the weekend, making tracks and planting trees. And it's where we, take our goats out. And so many people have been involved in that over the years. And it's also inspired other examples in and around our town of people taking responsibility for. And there's an element of taking over, but it's really important always to remember that these are public spaces. So and that you are dependent on the social license. And that's true, that social license is also important for what you do on your private allotment in relation to regulation, because that's one of the big questions, certainly in very regulated Australia, that people are always asking. Maybe that's less of a problem, I imagine, in Uruguay.
No, it's not a problem at all here, but I'm sure, I'm guessing, Sam, maybe you have like a homeowners association or something like that.
We do. It's technically optional, and it's actually the president is a permaculture natural gardener fan as well. So
good.
Yeah, I feel very fortunate. I mean, we don't have really any restrictions on that front. And what's really nice is it feels like there's a tide turning. I now get texts from neighbors being like, we just had a new neighbor move in and they have chickens. You have to go over and say hi. So
Yay.
I'm now
That's so fun.
I'm now the guy they text when there's new chickens in the neighborhood. So I think
Oh, I love that. Yeah, I mean, I think there is something when you first bring up something like this, people say like, well, I can't do it. There's too many regulations, there's a homeowners association, blah, blah, blah. And I do think that those in some places can be worse than others.
Sure.
But I also have seen examples of like a show don't tell, or like a beg for forgiveness rather than ask for permission culture. Like, I interviewed some woman who was up against her property went up against a Chicago Park District park, and she just each year kept planting more and more into the park, trees and different things, and nobody's coming over and measuring it. And so it's one of those things where you do have to push a little bit, but then when people see it, and as long as you're being respectful, I think it works well. And I guess to try to pitch this idea to your average suburbanite, a lot of people have this idea in their heads, like I can't do this. And I wonder if there is a case to be made, and I know you have this in your book, about downshifting, about self-reliance, about resilience, about being sovereign, that I think we maybe we could talk about, like just the benefits and the psychological and downstream benefits of sort of being more less dependent on the system and more self-reliant and in control of your own life. Is kind of freedom that comes with that.
Yeah, well, we've tried to sort of, again, use one of those decision-making matrices to sort of help people navigate this complexity, firstly, between an empowering control of one's physical environment for dealing with bad futures or living a better way, and the opposite of downshifting, simplifying, accepting, adapting internally to being comfortable with what unfolds. So that's on one axis. And then the other axis is whether you are consolidating in situ somewhere really well with good connections to place and community, or migrating to somewhere better or somewhere away from bad things that are happening. And then that creates 4 solution spaces. And the one that involves strong control and staying in situ, we call family castle, which is actually a reference to a cult comedy film, Australian film called The Castle. Might want to check that out sometime. That's certainly from an Australian perspective, we think it's hilarious. But the idea of, whether it's an extended family household or something, multi-generations, and actually making the retrofits to sort of in situ adaptation. And then in the other quadrant, migrating somewhere new, often to sort of, okay, we're going to do things better, maybe bigger, and the sense of whether informal or formal eco-village or some new group of people coming together to create some real capacity. And then in the quadrant of moving somewhere but minimalizing, we think of the mobile minimalists, the person in their mobile tiny house or whatever, very few possessions, staying here, contributing to this place for a while, maybe going somewhere else. And then the last quadrant we call adapt in situ. And it sort of emblematically is like aging with grace. Person saying, no, I'm just here simplifying. Yeah, I'm sort of maybe moving out of that house, or I'm moving out of that house into this 1-room bedstead at the back, and I'm renting my house to, someone else. So we can see how those patterns also relate to people at different stages of life, because there's sort of a very different thing when you're thinking about these things in your 20s to thinking about them in your 50s, say, for example. And there's also a complementary ecosystem between those, because the communal groups and the family castles actually have the capacities to contribute to welfare, looking after the lone older people at home, and the mobile minimalists have the ability to come and contribute energy and cross-fertilize between these different, places. So we see that as sort of helping people navigate those big decisions, because there are very sometimes big decisions that people make about, like, classic one is, we need to sell this house in the city and move to a regional town where we can get a similar house but clear our debt, and or no, we need to actually literally downsize to a smaller, simpler house and clear debt. Because debt, I think, for a lot of people, we've been saying for a long time in Retrosuburbia, is very problematic. And of course, people didn't see that when interest rates were the lowest they've been in the history of money. But, a lot of people are starting to see, looming debt as a huge challenge. So some of these things are sort of like easy first steps. Oh, we can do that. And others are sort of big, hard ones. And the other tool we've developed is the Retrosuburbia evaluation tool as a spreadsheet, which is downloadable from the website, and it's also in the book, looking at all the characteristics, the built characteristics of a site and the biological characteristics, to sort of give a score. Because one thing that people get into is a sort of a single factor analysis where they go, either my place, it's been great to live here, so why wouldn't it be good in the future? Just absolutely naive about it. Or the other, I can't do anything here until we move somewhere else because none of this works. And in fact, neither of those tend to be right. So being able to stand back a bit and look at, okay, what are all the factors, and to get a little bit numeric about that, to sort of give a score, and then, so how does this place sort of work sort of overall? Now, we've done that from an Australian, Southeast Australian, cool, temperate, Mediterranean climate perspective, and people elsewhere, need to use their intelligence to modify that and say, that factor, I wouldn't sort of put so much. Like we have factors like even in suburban areas of wildfire threat risk, which is a real thing in a lot of our suburbs, and that is in places like California too, but probably not so much in North Carolina.
No, we don't have that challenge.
I just want to briefly say before I let Sam go, what's so great about your book and your work in general is there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's like, figure out what works in your diverse set of circumstances, and and nobody is going to come in with like a one plan that's going to work everywhere in the world for every person. It depends on your age and your debt level and your house and all of these other things. A lot of people recently have been sending me messages, and I'm a novice, but they see me as somebody who knows about these things, and they say, like, how would you get from where I am, just a young person in an apartment, to where you are on some land? And I asked, like, where do you live? Do you have any kids? What kind of responsibilities do you have? What kind of job do you have? You really do have to just do the complex thinking for yourself. And it's kind of part of the process. There is almost like a psychological requirement and transformation that one must make, where you're not going to just be given a plan and to follow the plan. You really do have to have like more active participation in your life, I think.
Yeah, well, one of the things I noticed from decades of doing permaculture design work, and a lot of my work was advising people going out onto rural properties, starting from scratch, and then sort of seeing how that worked with different people over the years. Is that I noticed that obviously people who came from a rural background had some sort of prior skills, abilities, or disposition that helped them. But what I discovered was also people who came from families where their parents were self-employed, or small business people, often had a higher success rate because moving to the country and becoming more self-reliant and all of these things was like being in business. You actually had to take responsibility for all these different things. And that sometimes people who came from families where, their parents just worked, money went into the bank, kids never saw or understood any of the ups and downs of, cash flow or sort of opportunities or busyness at some times and not at other times. And that was psychologically harder to make a success for that sort of move. And there's still elements of that in doing that in a suburban context. You're taking responsibility for more things. You've got to juggle more things. So although, we call it downshifting, we're actually taking on a lot of the complexity that has been outsourced to systems that we have no control over. So the experience can be, oh, this is actually really complex. It's a bit like managing a household bulk food system, and garden food management is more complex than just going to the supermarket once a week.
Who would have thought, right?
Yeah, who'd have thought? But of course, it's also incredibly empowering because, not only do you get to design it, you have that inherent reward and connectedness that people so yearn, that is missing from modern lives, a connection to source lineage. Oh yeah, this came from so-and-so's garden over there, or this timber we've used to retrofit this was cut up when someone was salvaging a tree there. That those sort of connections and stories sort of are a huge value that people gain, apart from the resilience and the lower ecological impact of their lives. And you could say, oh well, that's just a sort of a symptom of how affluent and dysfunctional life has been in modern industrial societies, and very quickly people sort of get back to looking at the practicalities of a sort of, if you like, a peasant mind. Is this productive? Are we, did we get enough potatoes and pumpkins from that garden for the year? And all of those things that we'd actually associate with a sort of like a more economic mindset. And so there are these, like, we're reshaping or reblending all of those different parts when we, take on more responsibility in these ways.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things I found really interesting about your book is how it's so intentionally local. I think it's very clearly written in a way, and that to me connected with some of the work that Ashley and the rest of the people in DO are doing with these bioregional communities and meetups where, I didn't grow up where I am now. And so I lack some of that history of just the land and, what grows here. And so it's so useful. I know, your co-host, Jason, he lives 3-4 hours. So seeing what he's doing and people, just down the road, I'd love to hear your thoughts about local versus global and how you recommend people can learn about the history of where they are and, just better kind of connect to that.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely Retrosuburbia was unashamedly localist, right down to, Australian English, chooks rather than chickens. And yeah, the sun's sort of, coming from the north rather than the south.
I love that.
And And some of that, of course, is an invitation, for people to be empowered to reinterpret in their local context. Because even within Australia, you go to Brisbane, let alone Darwin, and you're in the tropics. Like a whole lot of the patterns in retrosuburbia, have to sort of shift. And connecting to those local sources, both in a climatic, soil sense, but also in many ways culturally too, and from the sort of transformation, like going somewhere like Uruguay, to even for us coming to Hepburn and connecting with some of those older fourth generation local people who had some of those skills and that history, that always old people who've lived in an area for a long time, uncovering the sort of hidden bits of history, including things that they might just take for granted but turn out to be really interesting. And that is both from a positive sense, but also, negative things about, past pollution that may be contaminating a place, events that happen, storm events. Often people in urban areas are a bit clueless about where water flows, when the stormwater system doesn't actually carry it all away, and the shock of, oh, we're in a valley and a wall of water came through the back door. How could that happen? So some of that is developing the skills of reading landscape, but a lot of it for a lot of people is talking to people who've been around. And that for us here coming to Hepburn Springs, and neither of us having grown up in central Victoria, and grandparents for our son being distant or dead, the old folks next door, became his adopted grandparents. And, that was an amazing lineage of connection where our son would just be up in this workshop, which was as clean as a kitchen. And a lot of my Aussie Street stories, some of the characters in it, Fred and Hilda, are sort of partly modelled on the neighbours we had here. I mean, Aussie Street story is taken from many, many different sort of experiences, and some of it my childhood growing up in Western Australia. But that connection to people who've been around for a long time, and people who've been doing the self-reliance thing, focused on this through permaculture and other ecological frameworks now for 3 or 4 decades, is a great source often for younger people to get started more quickly and not make the same mistakes.
Yeah. I have to say, from my part, in Uruguay, I don't know if this is just intuitive or what, or how I was raised, but just being respectful of local people, and then getting integrated, being involved in the community. My husband's he's a basketball coach on my kids' basketball team. This kind of thing where you're just showing up, you're meeting people, they know you, you learn skills, you integrate. It seems to work really well, and it's you got to just make do with what you have. Okay, so David, I'm going to make you pick sides in a doomer optimism, intra-doomer optimism fight. Okay, so I'm going to make my case, and I'm going to make the other case sound way worse because I want you to pick my side. But there's an annual versus perennial debate in doomer optimism. Now, no one is one side or the other fully. Everybody knows there's some sort of integration. But I personally have this vision that I don't know if you're familiar with this book, Tree Crops. But there's also this indigenous forest gardens, traditionally in Europe, all across North America, these managed permaculture systems. And so tend to say when people first started, first think about permaculture systems, think about livestock, and you get huge amounts of nutrition from these systems with less input. I think most people initially start with a giant garden, and some people love that, but then other people think like this is too much. All these calories are like mostly water. I'm pulling so many weeds, this kind of thing. So I'm making the annualist case sound bad, of course, because I want to win this debate. But where do you stand on the annual versus perennial, especially for a newcomer? Is my question.
Yeah. Well, I suppose obviously permaculture was enormously influenced. A lot of people would say, oh, well, permaculture was just a restatement. Permaculture One, the first book, was just a restatement of Russell Smith's Tree Crops, a Permanent Agriculture, which came out in the 1930s, pointing out the huge potential of trees to be grown on land that was not suitable for annual agriculture, and this unexplored potential of many of these species of nuts and fruits and whatever. And so, of course, that's been a big part of some people would say that's what the core of the permaculture idea was at the beginning. But in that, a lot of the systems that were being referred to and that we've found across the world, you see in the subtropics and especially the wet tropics, tree-based systems, forest gardens are almost a default form of local kitchen garden agriculture for people. So we know that, whereas in temperate climates, there's not so many examples. Now, we could say that that's because of the colonization of European systems that then turned all of those parts of the world into new Europes and then into industrial farming. And there's all sorts of things where people projected their own past cultural patterns, like why did we end up predominantly with cows and sheep in Australia when actually goats are much more suitable dairy animal, for example, in most of our landscapes? Because it's cultural, that only poor people in England and Western Europe had goats up in the mountains, and people on low-lying flatland, had cows. So, cows have higher status. And so people then projected that into landscapes that were sort of completely inappropriate. So there's all of those sorts of things that are at play. And those are actually also quite deep things about what people are used to eating. And I've become a lot more circumspect about this process, having gone through it as being a guinea pig of changing one's diet to reflect what the environment grows or what you're on about, to, gee, this is actually a sort of slow process. And that's from growing up raised on health food and, in previous generation, of shifting to, more of our food coming from tree crops. And we've done that, and we've had, the benefits from that. And we've also suffered the downsides of excess fruit production, too much acidity, actually being bad for teeth, because dentists only thought it was sugar in those days, but now they'll understand that it's actually acidity as well. And, that, actually in the healthy, balanced diet, maybe a higher proportion of vegetables to fruit. But, you translate that and move to the tropics or the subtropics, and, it's like the balance between plant foods and animal foods. You move to a much colder climate, naturally people eat more animal products and meat. And there was a study done in the 1970s of people doing the back to the land thing on the Australian east coast, and from Cairns in the tropics down to Hobart in the cool temperate. Even after a few years, there was already a gradation where there were much more vegetarians in the tropics and more meat eaters in the colder areas. So those factors are shaping things everywhere. But on balance, I see that there's enormous opportunities to have more productive framework of trees providing a skeleton that is providing the ecosystem service functions and shelter functions, especially at the suburban scale, from trees that are actually producing food and from perennials that are growing that are a backup system. So if just reducing this to a really practical level, we grow leeks that are perennial leeks that sprout off the bottom bulbs, and they're almost grow like a weed, and you've got to thin them out. But, and grown in really fertile soil, they'll produce a leek, maybe an inch diameter maximum. But we also sometimes grow, the annual leeks, which are fiddly, raising the seed and seedling, and it's a long cycle. But, like the best varieties, grown in really good soil are double that size and they're sweeter. So which is the perennial?
No,
or
David,
the
you have to pick a side. You can't say both. No, I'm just kidding. Briefly, I'll jump the line. I'm sorry, Sam. I want to ask one question while we're on this topic of diet. I plan to share this video with some of my colleagues, and I know many of them are advocates of veganism as a global diet. I wonder if you will just briefly address that before we have a couple other questions to ask you before we wrap up.
Yeah, it's a really big question, and I think if we look historically at where people ate very little animal product, and in some cases no animal products, vegan cultures in parts of India, that is where the population densities are high and the soils are fertile. And so you could say, well, the world is full now, and actually we have a lot more capacity to adjust fertility and water to make things incredibly productive for human food. But there is this gradation that in low fertility, low density environments, people got more of their food from animals for very, very good reasons, because the plants that grew in that environment were nutritionally unbalanced, and animals then getting the combination of all the little bits could balance that food. So there's a greater risk in where I live, in the most ancient continent on the planet, with a vegan diet, especially if it is local from your own soil, because you will need to be very, very careful about the nutritional balances. But if you are really on the ball with that and all the mineral balances, then it's probably okay if 10% of people in central Victoria in a low energy future were vegan, because there would be other people who would be controlling all the animals that are going to actually eat all your crops. So you would depend on them. And people don't realize this interdependence of people with different actual personal cultures. And this actually existed, I believe, in India, that the proportion of Muslims to Hindus right across India for many centuries was actually about an optimal balance between basically vegetarians, people who did also have dairy products from those cows, but the cows were sacred, you don't eat them, but cows keep sort of disappearing, and it was the local Muslims who were eating them. Now, people didn't need to want to be the same or, as those other people, but they understood the interdependence of themselves. And that's one of the problems, not just with the projection of veganism, but more generally, Western philosophical thought. If something is right, then it's best for it to be everywhere.
Right.
And if something is wrong, it's best for it to be nowhere. Well, in permaculture, it doesn't work like that. And if we go back in a deep philosophical sense, it's from Eastern philosophy, we learn this sort of balance, the yin yang, everything is, the opposite, the seed of the opposite is in it. And it's about, appropriate balance. And so that it's really hard to sort of, deal with all of those issues. And I haven't dealt with some of the ones about whether, certain land is only suitable for grazing. It's not suitable for growing crops. Like 2% of the Australian continent is arable land, is capable of growing crops, and a lot of that is actually unsustainable, so whereas some vast proportion of the continent has grazing animals, and whether they're kangaroos or sheep or cattle potentially can be sustainable, but you actually can't grow food, you can't disturb soil on that large scale. What we do know is, of course, you can grow plant foods on a garden agricultural scale anywhere, and do it sustainably.
Well, I'll quickly defend the annual camp. At least from a beginner perspective, I think when I was first starting, there's so much pressure when you're planting trees and perennials, because the benefit of them is they'll be there for quite some time. And I think the annuals provided a really great way to try a bunch of different things, see what works, and it also provides food very quickly. And obviously, the challenge with some trees and perennials is it takes quite some time. So I'm curious. The other big thing I'm very grateful that I got was some wise veterans telling me to slow down. That's not my nature, and to really lean in on observation. So I would love to hear your advice. Imagine somebody just took over a place in suburbia from a biological field perspective. What would you encourage they do for the first year, 2 years? Like, how would you approach that if you were taking over a piece of land?
Yeah, well, if I was starting from scratch, it's really doing those minimal intervention things that will give the maximum result. And exactly what you were saying, like, oh, well, there's a garden bed there that, maybe someone had some flowers in, or whatever. There's been some cultivation of the soil there, or there's these neglected veggie garden beds there. I'll put some, start getting that soil going and get some annuals going, especially starting with salad, and, starting with sort of high value things that are perishable and easy, and really getting the full understanding of the sun sectors, what happens, does water pond anywhere if you're on what appears to be a flat site, all of those, understanding all the hidden things under the ground that may have been grown over, or there's even sometimes sort of footpaths under lawns that have, the soil has grown over, rediscovering the archaeology, especially with older places. And I think that's a lot of those things also that can happen in the house behaviorally, like, start using a pea bucket and diluting that to add fertility into the garden, so very simple behavior change things, growing sprouts, or making yogurt, or starting to brew. In terms of wood heating, maybe sort of something you're thinking about, but rather than retrofitting a stove into the house, starting with a little simple rocket stove outside, or even the little drum fire that we've got in Retrosuburbia. Really simple things that are not locking you into the big decisions, and getting to look around the neighborhood, looking at, are there fruit trees, different species that are growing here that look like they're thriving, and dealing with and understanding the vegetation that's already in your place. And that ranges from, there's just lawn. Well, what actually is it? Which grasses are they? That one's easy to mulch out. That one's really problematic, or that there's these clovers that are nitrogen fixing there, or other weeds. There's dandelion. Actually there, you could make dandelion, roasted dandelion root out of those two. Actually know what you've got. And I think a lot of those things, can be started with the sort of no regrets of rather than, oh, we planted those fruit trees and actually those apples are, on Granny Smith's rootstock and they're going to require perpetual pruning because they're going to grow into gigantic trees that are too big for the site or too big to net to, protect from the birds. And if we'd got a semi-dwarfing rootstock, yes, it was in the right place, but, it wasn't, so those, sorts of questions that as you can sort of learn into what you're doing. And I think helping with other people on what they're doing and sort of building in that way and building those connections, building the skills, I think is the really, low-hanging fruit in that sense. Because that will help inform when and if you have to do things, sort of very quickly. Another thing is, of course, every backyard garden can be a tree nursery. You can have all this tree stock that you're actually raising, and whether it's simple things that you start from seed or more advanced things that, you learn grafting, or you can start seed things and then, okay, this tree would be useful as a seedling and you can get it going. But when we get good at grafting or can get someone else to graft it, they can graft that in situ. So there's a lot of that raising plants that you intending to plant, but you haven't actually made that commitment of where they're going in the ground.
Okay, so I have one last question. Maybe I'll let Sam ask one last question too. My last question is how there is this phenomenon of doomerism, like these people are just feeling so overwhelmed. We've talked a little bit about like just take a first step. There's so many actionable, like this is the Doomer Optimism podcast. The optimism is in action. It's in taking a first step, is in like, just reacquainting yourself with your own body, with nature, with your community, all of these things. But I also wonder if you might give just a little taste of like a vision, of a retrosuburbia vision fully realized. Talk to us about what that looks like and, help us imagine what all of our little steps could turn into if fully realized.
Yeah, of course, the potential of growth and change, like a whole suburb of what could be going on. We actually outlined that in Retrosuburbia of how many households might have sort of home-based livelihoods, that there might be retrofitting of things like old petrol stations and, even, decontaminating old petrol storage tanks, all sorts of businesses that could be operating within that fabric, and that the generation of power in different ways. So the possibilities for a high degree of self-reliance. In Retrosuburbia, we looked at the side of food production really closely, and in an essay called Feeding Retrosuburbia from the Backyard to the Bioregion, I took what I thought was a realistic view for our region and said that, that I saw that something like 25% of the food could be coming from actually backyards, 25% could be coming from what I call urban agriculture, like commercial production or community production on larger public spaces within the urban fabric and peri-urban. And then 50% would still be coming from bioregional hinterland, with a little bit from wild harvesting. And I thought that was a realistic thing to be aiming for maybe 20% of the population in a big city like Melbourne within 2 or 3 decades. But that vision is also assumes that there'll still be a big centralized system which will be much more armored, corporate controlled, and much more of a straitjacket. The idea that the whole world will sort of, like over a short time, transfer into some, permaculture utopia, I think is really unrealistic. And it's sort of building a parallel system that even as those central systems become harder and harder, if further down the track they completely break down, there is something that can actually spread and actually provide possibilities. But one shouldn't be so focused on going from how does we work out what I do to how is it a solution for the whole world. That's part of this delusion that something, for it to be relevant, must be able to be replicated everywhere and it work for everything. But I do, in that downloadable essay, it is a serious suggestion that it would be practical for, maybe 20% of the population to be living in that way, and the central system still to be functioning. But it won't be very good, you'll it'll be more like the Soviet supermarket system used to be. And I think the realities are that most people will continue to choose the security and the tightening straitjacket of whatever the central systems are doing. But there'll tend to be community enclaves where there'll be sort of like-minded people will tend to be more attracted to places where there is already similar things happening. And then that is a bit like creates an economy of scale or a culture of normality. But as my partner Sue Dennett says, with raising children, you only need another 2 families within walking distance to create a new normal for kids. And
Totally.
It's their generation that will actually create this vision anyway. So because they'll actually sort of like live into it rather than try and create it out of their heads. And I think that's so that thing of providing that environment in which the next generation can sort of just naturally create that world is a big part of what's required.
I love that vision. Yeah, I joke with people that starting a garden is a slippery slope. Like I used to try to convince people of a lot of these ideas, and now it's just like, can I get them to grow a few things? And I think the experience usually just takes care of itself. And they, start consuming and just really like sink their teeth into all of this stuff we're talking about. I'm curious, other than just starting to grow a few things, are there any kind of tangible, actionable things that people can do that are great entry points in this, or things that you would encourage, my neighbors in the suburbs to start embracing? Just a couple things that will be dominoes that get them going down this path.
Yeah, well, for a lot of people, the old thing of just exchange of gifting and getting different things back. A lot of people think of that as barter, and barter is something that how we deal with strangers and foreigners. Before there was money, we had barter. But for people we actually knew, it was actually a gift economy. You just gave things, and somewhere along the line you got something back. But it's like a social insurance system. Economists lie about this thing that money had to be invented because before money you had to have barter. Barter was for dealing with foreigners, people you couldn't trust. And that's what money replaced. But within community, within household, things were largely sort of gift economy. So in small ways, re-establishing that gift economy, the experience of that and the joy of that, whatever it is, it doesn't have to be just, what people produce. And I think the whole workshop area, people tinkering at home, and whether that's sewing clothes or, mending clothes or fixing something in the workshop, the whole sort of repair cafe culture of people learning how to maintain things and fix things, because I think a big part of that is that, yeah, how do we maintain what we've got so we're not dependent on throwing it away. So different people's entry points, like someone who's I characterize in Retrosuburbia, who's a mechanical engineer and their hobby is sort of vintage cars or something. You know, their hobby may be sort of pretty dysfunctional and consumptive, but, you know, that person's got amazing skills, you know, that might be transformed into what they can do in the workshop, you know, might be really valuable in the whole neighborhood. So people learning to sort of value what they can contribute, rather than them thinking, oh, I'm starting from nothing, I don't have anything to contribute, is, I think, a significant part, especially when we're thinking about it at the community scale, but it also relates at the household scale, that, you know, being in a household, and whether that's a family or whether it's people sharing, having complementary different skills actually is more likely to bring about harmony than we all have exactly the same needs and all have exactly the same skills. Because in nature, that's actually a setup for competition. Whereas difference is actually encourages cooperative behavior. Now, of course, for a lot of us, it's a matter of relearning or learning what we missed out on childhood, of trying all sorts of different things. And we need to try different stuff. But there's also an element saying, no, I'm actually really good at this and I can do that, you know, and someone else can do something else. So there's obviously huge household efficiencies when we do have our area of expertise, you know, and someone else has another, because certainly as single person households, there's a limit to how much complexity of self-reliance we can actually cope with. And one way of dealing with that is, of course, okay, it's community dependence, but the big thing that I've been emphasizing on is historically, larger households is the way people have survived difficult times throughout history. And my understanding in the United States is that average household size, the number of people living together, is actually starting to go up. It's just actually a natural response to difficult conditions. Now, and a lot of that is with gritted teeth and not necessarily very good. So Retrosuburbia is trying to help people. How can we do this better? Is part of that equation.
Yeah, this is so great. Just one brief comment. I'm teaching this home economics class starting on Monday, and one of the instructors is teaching home brewing, and I don't have a ton of enrollment. It's a pretty small class, and I was telling the instructors, like, are you guys okay with just being paid a couple $100 for your time, blah blah blah. And the guy wrote back, no, don't pay me, but you have to owe me. You're gonna just owe me a favor. And I thought that was so great, because he was just, really living it. And now I'm, next time I see him, I'll owe him something, and that's good. I like that, because he's doing something great for me. It feels like a gift to me. And then, I've got to be on my game, thinking, what can I give back? What can I barter back for this great gift that he's giving me? Your work is such a huge inspiration. Everything you've said is totally resonant with this doomer optimism community we're building. And just a point of, I guess, optimism for you. I know you've been working on this a really long time, but things are really shifting rapidly, and people are turning and much more interested in this than they have been. So hopefully that's exciting for you. I'm noticing a lot on the ground. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. And any last thoughts, comments?
Well,
obviously get the book. The book is full of like really specific, actionable advice. And other than that, I'll give you the last words.
Yeah, well, certainly in terms of the book has been out in Australia and through our distribution system, which is separate from Amazon. We haven't sort of dealt with those systems at all for ethical reasons. The book is now available sort of wholesale in the United States through our distributor, as well as retail. And so there's opportunities for people to actually get together and buy a few copies that would constitute wholesale discounts. And a lot of people don't realize that, you know, that possibility is there. The other thing we did with the pandemic was put the whole book online as a flip book that people can access. It's not as good as having the real physical thing in your hand. And that's on a pay what you feel basis. And we just took this huge risk that, you know, the undermining of printing, and all our books are printed in Australia. If we get the connections happening in the US, then we will start printing there as well. But we definitely see there's this huge potential out beyond the circles of, you know, permaculture related circles, you know, and we obviously want to see that really happen, because we know there's so many people who are, you know, starting on this journey of thinking this way. And Retrosuburbia is not a complete recipe book for everyone, but it helps frame what else they need to find out. And we're definitely interested in more case studies on the website. There's quite a few there, well beyond what the book is, and there's a lot of resources there that we'll keep maintaining and building that website more if we can, with the success of the book. So, yeah,
wonderful. So doomer optimists who are listening, let us know your case studies so we can send them into David to show beautiful versions of this vision coming to reality. And there are, I'm telling you, David, there are just, I mean, every day I'm seeing hundreds of different examples of people trying things, and it's super heartening. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your career and all your good work. It's really coming to fruition now. So hopefully this continues that.
Great. And I want to see photos of your gym in the garage there.
Yeah, I'll send it to you. And in return, I need the plans for the Undercroft workshop. Because I lost the garage for workshops, I happen to have a space in the backyard where the slope is. So I really like that plan as well. So I'm going to try to do that too.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. You are in the future, David. You are tomorrow. So you have a great day. We'll be going to sleep. And yeah, thanks so much. This was really lovely.
It's awesome.
Talk to you. Bye.
Okay. Bye.